You know, there's something poetic about the fact that the Game Boy Advance is the first system I've ever owned, and the first video I'm ever doing that's outside of PC gaming turns out to be a Game Boy one. Very likely that this is a thing that is only really sentimental to me, but nevertheless, this is kind of an exciting change of pace. It's like opening the door to a bunch of other possibilities, even though the Game Boy never exactly had a very impressive lineup of games when compared to other consoles. It still had some goodies though, like Super Circuit, Mario Bros. 2, Mario Bros. 3, Super Mario World. I just realized 3 out of those 4 games were remakes. I also just realized that my entire collection so far is nothing but Mario games, but you gotta give me some time here. Also, don't get too excited because we're not going to be talking about any of these, at least not yet. Instead, I'll be taking a look at Yoshi Topsy Turvy. If you reside anywhere outside of North America, you might be more familiar with this game being called Yoshi Universal Gravitation, which, wow, that is quite a mouthful, and with a name like that, I can't tell if this is going to be a Yoshi game or a lesson in physics. This is an odd little game for reasons I'll get into in due time. For now though, I just want to share a story about how I first found out about Topsy Turvy. I'll try to keep this brief because it's a pretty cliche story that I'm sure you've heard something similar a bunch of times already. But anyways, I was about 5 or 6 years old at a Toys R Us with my mom. I can't remember what we were doing there, but she let me go to the video game section to pick out one game for myself. I scouted through the aisles, trying to see if there's anything that would catch my attention, and there it was, Topsy Turvy. A game that looks pretty unimpressive, to be honest, but to a 5-6-year-old me, it was like the Mona Lisa. Something so good that I just had to have it. You gotta also keep in mind that around this time I was either balls deep into Yoshi's Island or I've just finished it. It was one of my favorite games and it still is to this very day. I'd really love to talk about it someday. Not to mention the fact that I was a Yoshi fanatic. I mean, who wouldn't be? He's a dinosaur that could spit out fire sometimes, sprout a pair of wings sometimes, and he eats things then poops out a little egg. Like, what is there to not love about this little guy? So yes, of course, considering all of that, I just had to get Topsy Turvy. I got back home, whipped out my Game Boy, played through like 3 or 4 levels, and oh man, did I hate it. My mom would have killed me for making her waste money on a crappy little spin-off title that I was so hyped about. And well, that's how I found out about Topsy Turvy. Now you might be asking, Danny boy, why even review a game like this? A game that you supposedly have a lifelong grudge against? And honestly, I don't know. For a while, I actually forgot about Topsy Turvy's existence, and it wasn't until I saw some Twitter post mentioning it where I remembered it was a thing that I played and hated. Through that, it sprouted a morbid curiosity of wanting to know if the game is actually as bad as I remembered it being, and I could be completely wrong. After all, I've only played about 4 levels of it. So that is why I'm covering this for my first GBA review instead of the handful of other games that would have undoubtedly been better and more appropriate for a video like this. But I guess without further delay, I should dive right back into Topsy Turvy 17 years later. Of course, when it comes to Nintendo and anything having to do with Mario, the plot for the most part is always going to be pretty simple, as is the case here. So there's this spirit named Hongo who has access to a powerful magical pop-up book they can use to lock things up within its pages. Interestingly enough, after the events of what I assume are all the Yoshi's Island games, Hongo sees that Bowser's being a and so he decides to lock him up in this little book. However, somehow in the process of doing that, he manages to lock up the entirety of Yoshi's Island too. And coincidentally, despite being terrible at his job, Hongo is not one for changing his mind, so there really isn't any way for Yoshi to revert this change without going through 6 chapters and gaining the favor of 6 different spirits. I gotta admit, I love how these guys are designed. They're just so simple, and you can understand what they're all about by just looking at them. Like the Spirit of Greed, who's got a lot of money in his pockets, and of course he's fat. Then the Spirit of Power, who of course is fat, or the Spirit of Speed, who resembles a rocket or a bullet. It's all very clever. Each of these spirits will give you an objective to complete in order to obtain a gold or silver medal, which you'll need a certain amount of at the end of each chapter in order to move on to the next. The first spirit you're introduced to is the Spirit of Cuteness, who wants you to eat an X amount of apples in every level to rescue her egg-linked children. What the hell did you just say to me? 100% completing every level will grant you a gold medal, which only increases your chances at getting a bonus minigame that might reward you with a 1-up if you do them successfully. These first few levels also let you get a good feel for Yoshi's unique new ability. So, show of hands, how many of you know that the Game Boy has motion controls? Okay, no, you're absolutely full of it, put them down. Okay, but yeah, the Game Boy did indeed have motion controls on a few technicalities. For starters, it wasn't really motion controls, but rather tilt controls. And secondly, the Game Boy didn't actually have this. It was the cartridges of the games themselves that came with a gyroscope that detected when the Game Boy was being tilted in a certain direction. You'd know when a cartridge is using this kind of tech when it looks like a big bulky eyesore. Tilt controls also weren't the only bit of extra hardware that some cartridges came with. Reddit user Blueleaf made an extensive list detailing all of these. Things ranging from games using a real-time clock to a rumble pack for haptic feedback, and I even found out about the Gluco Boy, a sort of game made to remind diabetic kids to check their blood sugar levels regularly. Funnily enough, tilt controls were very underutilized throughout the Game Boy's lifespan, with only 5 games using it, 2 of which were only released in Japan, and WarioWare Twisted actually used an improved sensor that was way more precise. I've never actually played Twisted before, but I wouldn't doubt that it's a much better experience when it comes to this, especially since it was received a lot better than Turvy. Not only that, but when you're playing Topsy Turvy, you can kinda tell that the tilt sensors are pretty basic. They can only detect 3 different orientations of the Game Boy, straight, left, and right. I mean, it works for most of the stuff you'll be doing, like pulling objects towards you, pushing them away from you, and you can even walk up walls, but it feels a little clumsy and honestly maybe a little unnecessary. Unlike WarioWare Twisted, where you're going through rapid-fire microgames that are solely designed around the usage of the tilt sensors, Topsy Turvy is a whole platforming adventure where, oddly enough, the whole tilt mechanic feels more like an afterthought. Don't get me wrong, you definitely use it, and you use it quite frequently, but rarely is it ever used for anything that's exciting. It's just for some really simple physics-based puzzles that barely even require any brain power to solve, and because of that, it becomes a little obnoxious to constantly have to do this, and it makes the mechanic feel more like a cheap gimmick. To Nintendo's credit and their subsidiary that developed the game, Artoon, the tilt controls are sometimes used in rather inventive ways, like the Shy Guy pirate ships or some of the bonus mini-games where you need to keep swaying your Game Boy left to right to build momentum. But then you go through them like 2 more times and they start becoming an example of how poorly implemented these controls are. I wish they would have used the shoulder buttons for this mechanic. For sure it wouldn't make the game nearly as interesting, but I feel like it would have made the gameplay a bit more seamless. Speaking of which, all gameplay footage you're seeing is from an emulator that's running the game with a no tilt patch that does that exact thing, and it's crazy just how good this actually feels. The game still isn't perfect, it has other issues that weigh it down, but at the very least it's somewhat tolerable now. Another thing I want to bring up is that the shoulder buttons on the actual game are completely useless. These were buttons that were designated for Yoshi's egg tossing ability in Island, but that's gone here. You know, the egg tossing ability, one of the things that made Yoshi so unique as a standalone character, just erased entirely. That's like taking Rayman and removing his ability to punch. Oh wait, they actually did that before. I suppose they still tried sticking to the egg theme with the Egglings. Please, stop saying that. Come to think of it, they really nerfed Yoshi in this. Another one of his abilities, the Flutter Jump, which had the potential to be absolutely busted in Island if you knew how to use it, is now so pathetic that in most cases you don't even need to use it. Ignoring the whole tilt control thing for a sec too, Yoshi also feels unnaturally stiff and heavy in this. I don't like it. It's such a stark contrast from how he was in Island. Okay, maybe it's unfair to compare these two, but I'm just saying it how it is. These controls are kinda dog water. Moving on to the next chapter, you're introduced to the Spirit of Greed, and it's more of the same kind of stuff, only this time you have to collect coins. I'm not gonna lie, there's not much to talk about here. After this, you've got the Spirit of Power, where you need to defeat X amount of a specific enemy, and then the Spirit of Speed, where you need to finish the level under a time limit. These objectives should provide some variation in the level design, but it really doesn't, at least not in any way that's super noticeable. Before I go any further, I just want to quickly bring up how Topsy Turvy goes about structuring its levels. Topsy Turvy, much like Rayman 1 surprisingly, divides its levels into multiple smaller sections. In Business, we call these sublevels. Or at least that's what I heard them be referred to as once or twice, maybe. Now, unlike Rayman 1, where there was actually a bit of meat to every sublevel, Topsy Turvy's sublevels can last anywhere from 3 minutes to only like 3 seconds. I'm not kidding. And despite their sometimes incredibly short length, they can still seem very repetitive, especially when they constantly reuse elements from other levels and put them in the exact same environment that you've already seen like 5 times now. You could probably make a drinking game out of the amount of times you run into one of these Shy Guy pirate ships or these wrecking balls that you have to use to break some boulders. These consistently pop up throughout the entire game and they never change, they just remain the same. Okay, sometimes you do use the wrecking ball differently, especially in the Spirit of Power levels, but the pirate ship never changes. It never gets any more complicated or harder. You'll always find it in these barren levels where you just gotta move it back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth just to get some coins or an apple. About the only spirits here that provide some level variation is the Spirit of Power, where obviously there's a bigger focus on enemy placement and the physics puzzles are only marginally more complex sometimes, and the Spirit of Speed, where most of the levels are exceptionally short and simple. There's a few things to help break the monotony up even further. You do eventually start getting double missions where, as you could probably guess, you get 2 different spirit objectives to complete instead of 1. These are fine, I suppose, but they don't really shake up the gameplay all that much. They could add as many objectives to these as they want, but it's not gonna stop these levels from feeling so similar to one another. Also, don't really like how even if you complete one objective, you still fail the entire level. Like, come on, I did 50% of the work, I should at least get like a bronze medal or something. Then they did also bring back the transformations from Yoshi's Island, but these are very hit or miss. I actually remember the first blimp level is what made me drop this game entirely when I was a kid. The tilt controls were really starting to annoy me here, but replaying this now, I think Blimp Yoshi is one of the better transformations. Also, just the way he looks is pretty funny. He looks like he's in pain. Yoshi, I know this is a regular thing for you, oddly enough, but you feeling alright, man? You don't look too comfortable doing that. Another one that I like is this Ferris wheel, but not because it's well designed or anything. I only like it because you can just hold your Game Boy in one direction and you'll beat the entire level. Then there's Boat and Ball Yoshi, 2 transformations that really showcase the worst part of tilt controls. With Boat Yoshi, you need to tilt the Game Boy in order to control the water levels so you can go over or under obstacles, and the controls here I find to be way too finicky and sensitive. Then Ball Yoshi is the total opposite of that, where like you know the game is sensing your inputs, but it mostly doesn't care and it does its own thing. It is a struggle to try and be precise with both of these transformations, especially when it comes to controlling Ball Yoshi. He is damn near impossible to control once he starts ricocheting all over the place. And if he lands somewhere where you don't want him to be, well, tough tits, you're just gonna have to keep going whether you like it or not. Oh, we're already going to be fighting Bowser? I thought there were like 2 more spirits we have to go through. Whatever, I guess I can't really complain, it seems like we're on the home stretch here. Although there's something up with Bowser, I don't know what's going on with him. He's all flat and he's floating somehow, I don't get it. Also, gotta say, it's pretty annoying doing this whole tilt platforming thing while trying to avoid his fireballs. Hate to admit it, but I've died quite a few times trying to complete this. What the hell is going on here? You still have a long way to go before you reach the last page. Good luck. Okay, yeah, I think I'm done here. Okay, fine, I'll talk about the last 2 spirits. There's the Spirit of Kindness, who is just the exact opposite of the Spirit of Power, where instead of defeating enemies, you simply have to avoid them. Her levels aren't built differently at all, and for being a chapter that's so late into the game, it's also surprisingly easy. Same goes for the Spirit of Fright, who teases you by saying he'll put something spooky on screen, but he just turns the levels into really slow auto-scrollers. You know, I think it's safe to say that they were starting to run out of ideas here. Oh yeah, and the actual final boss fight with Bowser? I don't really have much to say about it, honestly. It's a boss fight with janky tilt controls. It's about as bad as you might expect. So, Topsy Turvy, after 17 years, was I right for hating this game as a kid, or was I just dumb? No, it's pretty bad. Truthfully, I think it belongs in E tier. It gets a bump up to a D though with a no tilt patch. I am grasping at straws here, trying to think of at least one thing that was done decently well in Topsy Turvy, and I'm drawing blanks. The soundtrack isn't so bad, but at the same time, it's really nothing to write home about. I've definitely heard better. The art style looks okay sometimes. I do like how they were trying to recapture that Yoshi story aesthetic with things in the environment being all arts and crafts, but I can't ever get past just how compressed and squished all the character models are. It really brings the visuals down a peg. I guess I could commend Nintendo's and Artoon's efforts to experiment with something new, but honestly, I don't even think they want to remember this game. Topsy Turvy's whole selling point was its usage of tilt controls, and it wasn't even able to do that right. Like I've said, it feels like an afterthought, as if they're developing Turvy to be a regular platformer, and then randomly decided to staple tilt controls onto it about halfway through. Rarely is it ever used for anything exciting, and when the game introduces something new, half the time it's just a pain having to deal with these controls. Funnily enough, the game is much better without them, but even when that's the case, that doesn't excuse the lackluster level design. There are so many things that are effortlessly recycled a dozen times, and they barely ever change throughout the entire game. I even noticed that they straight up copied some levels and did like the bare minimum to make them stand out from one another. It's no wonder why Topsy Turvy is probably one of the more obscure titles in Nintendo's whole catalog, because it is just painfully mediocre. With all that said and done, I'm gonna go back to pretending like this game never existed and enjoy some good old Yoshi's Island.